But for the first time, Canadian liquefied natural gas is heading overseas.
Canada can be the #1 exporter of LNG to Asia.
I will guarantee decisions on major projects within.
While the world was still glued to Trump's fiery tweets, Canada quietly launched a move that could shake the very foundations of America's global dominance. For the first time in history, Canadian liquefied natural gas, LNG, was shipped directly to Asia without passing through the U.S. market. This was about much more than just energy. It was as if Canada had cut the cord that had tied its economy to the United States for more than a century. For decades, Washington dictated the rules. Over 90% of Canadian crude exports flowed south to American refineries, fueling the U.S. economy. Now, Canada is carving out a new, more independent path, not only in energy, but in shaping its economic future. This was a clear signal that Ottawa is ready to step out of Washington's shadow and define its own role on the global stage. Today, China, not Washington, has become the largest buyer of Canadian crude. New pipelines and deep water ports are opening direct routes to the Pacific. While Trump's 35% tariff looks more like a burst of anger than a coherent strategy, what is really unfolding is a truth the U.S. wants to hide. Canada's quiet transformation, achieving what no trade war has ever done, eroding America's influence right in its own backyard. Picture July 8, 2025. No ceremony, no media spotlight, no political speeches, just a massive LNG tanker silently cutting across the Pacific. That ship carried with it the end of America's 75-year energy supremacy. Since the Second World War, Canada had acted as the loyal supplier, sending as much as 97% of its energy exports directly to the United States. Oil, gas, and stability flowed south, feeding U.S. refineries and keeping fuel prices affordable for American consumers. But now that era of dependency is closing and a new path is opening for Canada. One where we no longer stand behind the United States but assert our own place on the global energy map. Americans called it a partnership, but in reality it was one-sided reliance, with Washington being the one dependent on supply. That illusion shattered when Trump wielded tariffs. On August 1, 2025, his 35% tariff on Canadian energy took effect. He believed this would force Ottawa to retreat. Instead, it awakened a long, silent giant. Prime Minister Mark Carney wasted no time on harsh words or social media sparring. His answer was forged in steel and concrete: an $18 billion LNG export terminal in Kitimat, British Columbia, now 98% complete. And the first shipment to Asia, it had already left port before Washington even realized. For the first time in history, Canadian gas was not flowing through the U.S., but directly to China's booming market. This was far more than just an energy deal. It was like severing a pipeline straight into the heart of the U.S. economy. After more than a decade of watching trade wars, I can say this with certainty. The gravest threats always mirror a nation's deepest fears. Trump's tariffs were never truly about fentanyl or trade deficits. What keeps Washington awake at night is something else: the haunting fear of losing control over North America's energy lifeline. Think back to the oil crisis of 1973, when Americans lined up for hours at gas stations. The economy nearly froze, all because foreign suppliers turned off the tap. That vulnerability never disappeared. It was only hidden under the veneer of stability thanks to Canadian supply for half a century. For 50 years, Washington treated Canadian oil and gas as an entitlement, something that could never be threatened. But the reality is much harsher. Canada pumps about 4.9 million barrels of oil per day, nearly 4 million of which roughly 80% flowed south. This made the U.S. both the world's largest oil importer and paradoxically the nation with one of the most secure energy supplies. Why? Because Canadian oil carried something no other major source could guarantee: political stability. Venezuelan crude was crippled by turmoil. The Middle East could be thrown into chaos by a single attack. But Canadian energy, Americans once believed it was the one supply that could never be turned into a weapon. That belief was erased on July 8, 2025. Energy dependence is like being trapped in a toxic relationship. You know, it's damaging, but you cling to it because you can't imagine life without it. Now, Canada is charting new escape routes, and none of them lead back to Washington. The completion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion has reshaped the entire landscape. China has now become the leading foreign customer for Canadian crude, with an average of 207,000 barrels per day shipped directly across the Pacific since the line came into operation. In the past, most of that oil would have flowed south through pipelines to serve the United States. But the real blow comes after. Oil is only the prelude. The decisive strike lies in liquefied natural gas, LNG. For generations, Canadian oil and gas inadvertently served as a hidden subsidy for American prosperity. Cheap fuel kept costs low across the board. From transportation and manufacturing to food prices, that security shield has now been torn apart. The tariffs Trump imposed have done more than trigger a simple trade war. They are shaking the foundations of North America's entire energy supply chain, which has been stable and operational for more than 75 years. And once that system fractures, the consequences extend far beyond the price of oil. Canadian gas doesn't just heat millions of American homes. It fuels chemical plants, produces the plastics and smartphones, the fertilizer for farms, and the synthetic fibers and clothing. If this flow becomes unstable, or worse, if prices are set in Beijing rather than Boston, it is not just about the cost of gas, but about a way of life being upended. While Washington struggles to decide how to respond, Asia has already emerged as the destination of the future. Canada sees this clearly. TC Energy's leadership has even claimed that Canada is on track to become the world's largest LNG exporter to the Asian market. And the partners waiting are not weak buyers, but major economies.
Every Canadian oil tanker heading west to Asia instead of south to the U.S. is another hammer blow to Washington's energy dominance. Supply chains are being rewritten. Prices swing unpredictably. The geopolitical chessboard has been thrown into disarray overnight. American refineries, long spoiled by cheap Canadian crude, are now forced to live with higher costs and unstable supply. Prime Minister Carney put it plainly. 85% of trade with the U.S. remains untouched by tariffs. But the remaining 15% is where the real power lies. And that 15% is no small share. It is machinery, steel, infrastructure, the critical elements that keep the energy system running. The Midwest is the fatal weak point. Refineries there are built specifically for Alberta's heavy crude, thick as asphalt, a grade that almost no other supplier in the world can replace. Re-engineering the entire system to process lighter oil would cost billions and take years. Time Washington does not have. Meanwhile, Asia is moving quickly to seize the opportunity. Japan, still haunted by Fukushima, views Canadian LNG as a safe and cleaner bridge toward a renewable future. South Korea, living under the constant shadow of unpredictable neighbors, places its trust in secure shipping lanes that avoid conflict zones. And in Europe, still reeling from the energy crisis triggered by the war in Ukraine, quiet negotiations have already begun. From LNG terminals on the Atlantic coast to a three-ocean energy strategy, Canada is steadily building a new network in which the U.S. is no longer the hub. Shockwaves are hitting Wall Street. American energy giants once enriched by cheap Canadian crude are watching their profits erode. Billions poured into U.S. pipeline projects are now stalled, shelved, or scrapped altogether. The reason is clear. The single foundation they once relied on, stable Canadian supply, has disappeared. This is the ticking time bomb Washington refuses to face. Because once new trade routes are established, they endure for decades. Trump may win another term, but these pipelines will still be carrying Canadian energy to America's rivals well into the 60s. The irony is inescapable. What was once promoted as a way for the United States to secure its energy independence has now backfired, turning its most loyal supplier into a partner of its fiercest economic competitors. The numbers are staggering. Since the Trans Mountain expansion, Canada's exports to China have surged by more than 340%. The oil that once flowed into American refineries is now fueling Chinese industry, powering South Korea's steel mills, and generating electricity in Japan. The U.S. is not only losing market share, but is also indirectly fueling the economic and even military strength of its rivals. What Canada is building is not just pipelines but escape routes from Washington's grip. In this century, energy means power, and that means the balance has shifted permanently. The future will catch America off guard. Canadian energy is no longer heading only eastward. It has already moved beyond any control from the White House. Every dollar flowing westward from Asia is another blow to America's energy dominance. Just 18 months ago, 97% of Canada's energy exports depended on American buyers. Today, Canada has direct lines to the fastest-growing energy markets in the world, China, Japan, and South Korea. No middlemen, no discounts, no approval from Washington. This is the decisive shift. LG prices in Asia are 40% higher than in North America. And for Canadian producers, this is not just market diversification, it is a leap forward. Once the revenue starts flowing, there is no reason to go back to selling cheap to the U.S. This is not merely a change in trade, it is a shift in power across the entire continent. For 75 years, Canada was seen as a low-cost energy source for America. Now, things are different. We are becoming a global force with 3 oceans to trade across and the ability to choose customers willing to pay the highest price. The ports are built, the tankers are sailing, the contracts are signed. The only question that remains is whether the U.S. is ready to accept a world where the loudest voice is no longer the strongest one. While Trump rages on Twitter about tariffs, Canada has quietly redrawn the global energy map. And this time, we do not need America's permission.